Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Leila Logisiko. I'm the president of the City Club, and tonight we gather to discuss a project of enormous consequence, one that will shape the future of the waterfront development industry and freight transportation in New York City, and I'm referring to the Brooklyn Maritime Terminal. The Brooklyn Maritime Terminal is a 122-acre city-owned parcel, and it represents one of the last great opportunities to envision the future of our waterfront that serves the public interest. And yet, this planning process is barreling ahead with little community input. Officially, this effort has been framed as a community-driven visioning process. A task force convened by the New York City Economic Development Corporation, EDC, is guiding the site's development. But in practice, the process has been rushed. And this is not just about Red Hook. The deficiencies in the process reflect a broader trend, one in which major land use decisions are determined in a way that could invite more public debate. So tonight, we're very fortunate to have a panel of planning experts, community leaders, and advocates who will unpack what's at stake, dissect the shortcomings of this process, and discuss how we can rethink the way we plan and develop major public sites. I'm very, very happy to introduce our panelists. We're very fortunate to have with us a distinguished group of panelists who will bring expertise, live experience, and deep engagement with the Brooklyn Maritime Terminal project. Each of them offers a unique perspective on the challenges and stakes of this redevelopment effort. James DeFilippis is a professor of the School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University, and he's also a longtime resident of the Columbia Street waterfront, living directly across from the site. He's also an active member of the BMT Neighborhood Alliance, giving him both an academic and deeply personal perspective on the future of this development. Carly Baker Rice serves as the executive director of the Red Hook Business Alliance, where she advocates for the needs of local businesses in a neighborhood shaped by its maritime and industrial legacy. A Red Hook resident herself, Carly is also a member of the BMT task force, participating directly in the process we're discussing tonight. Deborah Gans is a professor at the Pratt Institute School of Architecture and a longtime Red Hook resident. She has been actively involved in the limited public engagement effort conducted by consultants hired by the city. Her expertise in urban design and community participation provides critical insight into how public processes shape and at times fail to shape major developments like this one. And moderating our discussion tonight, I am thrilled to introduce David Burney. David is the co-founder and director of the Urban Placemaking Management Program at the Pratt Institute School of Architecture. A former commissioner of the City Planning Commission, David also serves as commissioner of the New York City Department of Design and Construction and chief architect of NYCHA. Making him uniquely positioned to guide this discussion with an understanding of both government decision-making, economic needs, and principles of equitable urban development. And with that, it is my pleasure to turn it to David Burney. David, take it away.
Thank you, Leila. Do you want to put that image up while we discuss it? There we go.
Here you go.
I just thought it was helpful to have a point of reference. We're here to talk about the future of the Brooklyn Marine Terminal. And looking at this image, just to the left, obviously, is Governor's Island. In that sort of orangey color is the site that we're talking about. Just to the south of the drawing there is the UPS, currently the UPS site. Just north of that, the Brooklyn Cruise Terminal, Pier 12 and 11. Just to the north of that, the Red Hook Container Terminal, and then two piers, 9A and 9B, that have been condemned and abandoned. Pier 8, which is still in use, and then at the very top of the drawing, Pier 7, that's in use currently by the Customs and Excise Department. So these are the 122 acres. For decades, this was part of a vibrant Brooklyn waterfront industry, employing hundreds, maybe thousands, forming the gateway for goods coming into the city and into the rest of the country. And even after the decline of most of the maritime industries in New York Harbor and the moving of a lot of the large container work down to deeper water, the BMT continued to function. And even now, it's handling somewhere between 60 and 90,000 containers a year coming into the existing container terminal. It's rather sad that years of neglect by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey have left only one crane still in service, several of the piers condemned, and this, rather disgraceful dereliction of responsibilities, I think, led last year to the Port Authority making a deal with New York City to exchange the BMT for a city-owned site at Howland Park Marine Terminal on Staten Island. So this presented an opportunity for the city to take over and bring the waterfront back to life. And it presents a fundamental land use question. Should maritime uses be preserved and expanded, or should other waterfront uses, such as housing, commercial uses, and hotel uses, be permitted and encouraged? And more to the point, how will the future of these 122 acres be decided? Now, on the one hand, you might argue, well, given the difficulty of getting anything done in New York City, let alone a major waterfront plan, it's expeditious to hand it over to an organization like the city's Economic Development Corporation and find a way to circumvent the very cumbersome and rather imperfect city review process. On the other hand, what's been put in place might be seen as an end run around any serious debate. Responsibility for the planning of the site has been given to the EDC, an agency that really has virtually no public oversight, leading to a general project plan by New York State that evades the usual public review process for city projects and restricts input in the decision-making largely to the work of the task force created by EDC to oversee the project. We're already beginning to see there's a broadly held perception that the Economic Development Corporation has rather stacked the deck before the process has started. EDC's presentation of the terms of the discussion to its task force already assumes that the maritime uses will be restricted to the one lone crane that's still operating and the cruise ship operation, with the rest of the site being sold off to residential real estate, albeit with the usual concession to affordable housing that probably won't be affordable to anybody that you know. Nevertheless, this kind of neoliberal approach assumes that only the, quote, best and highest use, i.e. the most profitable, will work to fund any redevelopment. The planning process, led by EDC, accepts this premise as a given. So for tonight's discussion, we're not going to dwell so much on the specific uses of the site, because in the upcoming weeks, 2 other panels will be held focusing on the implications of the development to the future of ports industry, freight, and waterfront resilience in the city. Instead, our expert panelists will address the question of the process by which this and possibly other major land use decisions are being made. Is the EDC's role as lead for the planning process working? Is it the best way forward, or is there a better process? So with that, I would like to open the discussion with James, and we'll go with James and then with Carly and then Deborah. And at the end, I will pose some questions to them and perhaps then open it up to other questions from the participants tonight. So James, please go.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Layla and City Club for inviting me to be part of this. David mentioned the long-term disinvestment in the piers. And I think that that's an important part of the kind of planning process, right? Was the Port Authority simply being unwilling to properly maintain a maritime facility for the area. The other part of that David didn't mention is when the Port Authority reached a deal with the Economic Development Corporation to turn over site control, although not ownership of the land, but site control to the Economic Development Corporation, 2 things happened. One, the turnover of site control, but not the ownership of the land, meant that they could avoid ULURP, right? There are some precedents around where city-owned land can go through a disposition to a private owner without ULURP, but basically the city charter is pretty clear that if the city is going to lease or sell city-owned land, it has to go through a ULURP process. The second thing is that at least as the EDC has understood it and has indicated repeatedly, when when they took over the decrepit and disinvested piers, the EDC agreed that whatever development would come thereafter would be doing the remediation on the crumbling piers. And the reason why that's important, aside from the fact that in Brooklyn Heights and Brooklyn Bridge Park got the Port Authority to do the remediation itself, and we didn't. And there's an inherent statement about, for whom does public investment happen, and for whom it does not happen. But beyond that, it then burdens the development project with the demands of not only the work that is done there having to pay for itself, but having to also do the remediation of past disinvestment, right? And so on some level, the planning process was set before, and the planning outcomes, which we're not meant to really talk about here, was set before we even started the process, right? The EDC, is essentially a real estate shop. It is technically speaking, not-for-profit corporation that is connected by contract to New York City government, but it is a real estate development shop first and foremost, right? And one of the striking things, and people don't often talk about it, is that Section 1 of the EDC's bylaws are that the board chair of the EDC shall be directly appointed by the mayor, quote, after consultation with the Partnership for New York City, Inc., right? So the business community is, centrally determining who the board chair for the EDC is. That language does not, there's not similar language for, say, the Central Labor Council or, the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development or any of the entities in New York City, right? And I think this is important because there are a set of assumptions that inform the EDC's worldview as a not-for-profit, that it connects the city government to for-profit developers and the kind of public-private partnerships that the EDC pursues all the time, right? And those assumptions about the financial feasibility and financial viability of development projects run through pretty much everything that the EDC does, and it is very evident with the BMT site here, right? And so once we assume that the project and what happens on the project needs to pay for itself with revenue streams generated on site, then essentially a whole set of decisions have already been made, right? And everything is straitjacketed from those sets of decisions, right? But I want to be really clear, right? Why should a port development project, which would benefit the entire metropolitan area by getting freight off of the highways, have to fully pay for itself on site, right? When the benefits are metropolitan area wide? Why should a park, which generates enormous public physical and mental health benefits, and in the narrow, if I can use the narrow economics language, right, of positive externalities, why should it have to pay for itself, right? The reason why economics developed a language of externalities, of positive externalities in this case, is precisely because the outcomes of transactions are not internalized in the cost. Right? And at a time when there's very, very little meaningfully affordable housing in New York City, why should a housing development and its desirability be measured solely in terms of its ability to pay for itself? Importantly, the cost to the city of not doing the port, right? The cost of increased truck traffic contributing to congestion, right? The entire economic logic for congestion pricing is precisely that car volume and truck volume generates negative externalities for everybody else, right? That's why we have them. The cost of the respiratory problems that come from increased trucks on our road, and the less efficient and therefore more costly movement of freight to consumers and businesses in the city. Those are all outside of the financial accounting that is informing the EDC's framework, right? Similarly, the costs of not having deeply affordable housing for people who might wind up homeless are also invisible in the modeling frameworks of the EDC, right? Homeless service provision is far from free, which is a whole other set of conversations, right? But the absence of these costs as a financial, component is striking, right? And a similar point could be made about the mental and physical health benefits of parkland and the cost incurred by a lack of mental or physical health. It is astonishing to me that so soon after COVID, we have already erased the economic benefits of good mental and physical health from how we think about our land use planning. Right. Therefore, even within the narrow metric of costs, right, this is financial modeling based on a site's value and the revenues generated within that site. It takes the already shrunken measure of financial viability, right, and discounting everything else that land use planning might be taking into account. And it reduces it even further to erase the externalities that might result from what is built or what might result from what is not built on the site, right? This is public planning that is so internalized the logics of the market that it externalizes exactly the costs and benefits that market actors externalize. Right? But of course, these externalities are exceedingly difficult to measure, right? And they're difficult to model. It is hard to construct, models on what the benefits might be of good health because of good park space, right? But the fact that they're hard to model doesn't mean they aren't real, right? And we should not have a planning process in which the only things which can be in which only the things that can be counted are allowed to actually count. Right. I want to end my comments with a quick note. 15 minutes into the very first, sort of information session in August, which is a great time to introduce people to a big land use planning fight is in the dead of summer. I texted one of our community leaders, Guy, I think of as the mayor of the block, basically, and I was like, this is what the EDC will plan for us based on what I've heard in these 15 minutes. We will get market rate condo towers, B, cut through corridors among the condo towers to allow some public access to the waterfront. See some advanced manufacturing and maker spaces for like the hip kids that are coming out of Pratt. Nothing personal, guys. And D, ferry terminals for rich people who like to take the ferry. That's the plan. That's what EDC will give us. And all of this is going to be bullshit theater on the way to that plan. That is what I texted in the middle of August, 15 minutes into the EDC's process. And aside from the fact that all the market rate housing is being coded rental instead of condo, pretty much everything else I've said is what the EDC is giving us. I would just end super quickly with, this is not over. A GPP may sidestep a ULURP, but GPP process is still take a long time. There's still many stages. And I'm a native of Flushing. I do a lot of work with organizers in Western Queens. I remember when Amazon's arrival through a GPP in Long Island City was a foregone conclusion. And I think people on this call know how that went. Thank you.
Right, thank you, James. Well, I have a few questions for you later, but actually, in the meantime, if you have questions for James or any of the other speakers, there's a Q&A function on your screen at the bottom, and you can put your questions in there. And at the end, I'll comb through and try to pose those questions to our speakers. So thank you, James, and let's go on to Carly. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And thank you, James, for setting that up. So given the selection of the GPP process, the way it avoids not only the many processes, but many layers of constituents' political power, so it bypasses the community board, the borough president's office, city council, and given a timeline that is a sliver of what would normally occur for other large projects and decisions in this city, even other GPP scenarios, It goes without saying that the process established in the absence of both the time and the procedure would need to be well designed and impeccably run. Of course, we're here because that's not the case. Just at a high level, the process is a voting task force, advisory groups, and public engagement sessions. Part of the problem is that they're not following their own process. Only selective feedback from all levels of engagement have been used, and that applies to both the feedback that's supposed to be used on the engagement process itself, as well as the feedback on the site planning. And expertise at all levels is not being fully utilized, which ostensibly was the point for bringing together community, city, and regional perspectives through the task force and the advisory group. But also at all levels, public input, advisory groups, task force, there's been a considerable frustration on the process. And that continues to the 7th month of a 9-month process that started as a 5-month process. So things are not going well, and progress is hard to point to. Questions, concerns, corrections to information delivered, and requests for information are not addressed or addressed in very narrow and selective ways. Basic cardinal rules of modern engagement are being broken. For example, you shall not request input from participants without telling them how it will be used, whether it's an email or an opinion. The Lego modeling exercise that has been used at all levels encouraged people to put enough housing on the property so that the math equation that they had wrote worked out. That math equation itself contained numbers that a lot of the experts in the room had significant concerns with, but the exercise was not updated. And no one was informed until after that what they put on the board, ostensibly in conjunction with the conversation, would be taken as ideas that they have put forward for the site plan. So as you might imagine, later groups started refusing to use the Legos. We've been delivered scenarios that are introduced as reflecting the themes coming out of the engagement process, which clearly do not. I serve on task force at the state level as well, working on the implementation of the Climate Act. And as part of that work, we thoroughly debate and create guidelines for public engagement. I've learned a lot. The engagement process here is just not what is acceptable in a modern context. In addition, the whole proposal is pretty old school, and it's not leveraging processes that have been put in place to disrupt those old patterns. Months ago, I started asking why we're not using the city's environmental justice plan, which is still being finalized. However, it would be really a shame for it to simply not be used on this major project that touches multiple DAC of disadvantaged communities. The state COCPA processes, which require 30 to 40% of benefits for green infrastructure to go to DACs, mum on that. The recently created racial equity plans. EDC should right now have a drafted racial equity plan, which among other things would require it to deal with its own history of disinvestment in this property. Climate budgeting, a whole raft of other new laws that have been put in place to help us do better are just sidelined at this point. The upshot from a purely practical and outcomes-focused perspective is that what has been provided as scenarios to date are too thin to be considered a plan and are not based on research that is of the quality, depth, or completeness that any large company or government would expect to use to make a decision of this magnitude. I say this as someone who worked as a consultant for many years, over a decade, to federal governments, state governments, and very large corporations. That is not to say that there aren't very capable people working on this who in some ways want to do good, but the right parameters were not given, the right questions were not asked, not enough of the right people are being talked to, not enough ideas, risks, or precedents are being explored or developed, and frankly, the consultants are not accountable to the decision-making body. Their client is the EDC. That's a structural problem. Finally, long-standing structural issues surrounding this project are also making good planning processes harder. The working context, both private and public, has lost its own process for even thinking about waterfront and maritime. To paraphrase something Carolina Saguero of Portside has reminded people in various settings through this process, if we're talking about land use, then we've been missing the boat on thinking through how to use the waterways.
Right.
Kind of, it's, apples and oranges.
Mhm.
The Blue Highways Initiative is, by the EDC's own assessment, in a nation state. It's a regional need that is being run by NYC EDC, City DOT, with the EDC's consultants. It really hasn't gotten very far in thinking through how new industries may use this property. And so they're more blocking out a shape on the property and listing the things it could be used for in the future. That's kind of where we're at on that plan. There's a real vacuum of expertise and authority at city, state, and regional levels on maritime. The state looks to the Port Authority for maritime direction. The Port Authority is looking at bridges and airports. All of New York Harbor needs maritime investment, but there's really no one agency or no person responsible for understanding the strategic importance of maritime, ensuring that it is planned for and funded. So we have 90% of our supply chain coming by trucks over bridges. 2 weeks ago, the U.S. House Subcommittee on the Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation held a hearing about how behind we are as a nation on shipbuilding and port infrastructure, and what a national threat it poses both on DoD front as well as economics and supply chain. Trying to do BMT planning in the context of a lack of process for thinking, planning, and envisioning port infrastructure at city, state, and national levels is impacting the success of this project. So what we have is tomorrow, Task Force Meeting 7, and we're still trying to figure out how to have a useful meeting, why we can't get better research, how to get better research, and why all of our questions, requests for information, corrections, or concerns from the last meeting haven't yet been fully addressed. It's frustrating not only because of the fact that there just isn't a winning process, and talking about process for 6 months is really boring, but because there are so many capable people in the room who could put together something truly awesome, not only through their own expertise, but through their extensive international networks, that could be a political win for everybody at all levels. And we're just nowhere near that. And now we have 1.5 months left. So I'll leave it there and pass it on.
Thank you, Carly. Yes, thank you, Carly.
Thank
Many
you
questions for you also. So Deborah, you're up.
Thank you for these brilliant high-level presentations. I'm the little community member, and that's my role in this presentation, but it's also kind of who I am. But I also happen to be an architect with around 20 years experience in community-based planning from the bottom up. But often with high stakes scenarios, as in Katrina. So as I engage with the EDC website calls a community driven process and play with the Legos Carly mentioned, I'll show them to you, I can't help but measure it against what I personally have come to think as good community engagement. And so here are the steps, and I'm kind of gonna measure the EDC against them. There are 5. So the first, and you've heard some of them because it's true for the task force too. Step 1 is knowledge sharing. A community needs to hear from objective experts, not just from the EDC in this case, pertinent technical and economic information and issues, the working and economies of ports, the multiple skills of policy and governance that overlay the site, overlapping planning initiatives that James was talking about, the BQE, coastal resiliency. A community needs to understand full financial parameters, even if they're not the task force, especially if the community is going to be expected to make trade-offs. Finally, this is a two-way street. There should always be time set aside for the community to present their local knowledge. And what James said is so important. Things like air quality and asthma, these are implicit economic benefits that the community is the one who knows, they experience it firsthand. The community needs to be able to question EDC's assumptions, financial and otherwise. Without this conversation, there is no trust. And I think that's I could stop there. There is no trust in the process. And of course, then the community cannot form a really informed creative response. So has this happened? I think you've kind of heard, not really. The task force, as Carly said, I actually have heard that they feel like there's almost too much information presented only by EDC and there's not enough time for discussion internally, right? And that's discussion is really as important as the knowledge sharing. And of course, no structured way to get it back to the community at large. As for the community, me in this role, EDC has shown us the basics of port geography, some stats on employment, some local history, a little bit on current government funding, a couple of port initiatives actually that are successful, but it's all pretty sketchy and it's the 1,000-foot view. The complete financial picture, which you've been hearing a lot about, is the most important omission. We don't know the value of the land to the developer. What are the costs of the peer repair and the potential, which goes up and down, like by a million, it started out in millions, it ended up in billions. And what are the potential revenue streams for the port leasing? If there is a pro forma, we haven't seen it. That's why when the EDC announced at the end, very abruptly at the end of December, and as it started in August, that between 7 and 9,000 units of market rate housing were needed to pay for public, community, and private port infrastructure, the community reacted with distrust and disbelief. Firstly, because the facts supporting the claim had not been shared, whether they exist or not. And secondly, because many at that point, having gone through the process, had no appetite for the plan for various reasons, from gentrification to scale, to the funding of the port. Note that the EDC website, if you went on it today, the opener still says nothing about housing or the need for private money to pay for the public good. Step 2, guiding principles. In a good community-led process, after knowledge sharing comes the forging of a statement of values and guiding principles. Environmental equity and/or the value of your property, a working waterfront, or a mixed-use neighborhood, or investment in the existing built fabric. This is the key discussion. What for the community is non-negotiable for the majority and is at least something that others can live with. You never get unanimity. This statement of values and principles should then guide an iterative master plan development. And then after that, the designs that flow from it. At our community meetings, the EDC started every presentation by sharing their goals. Some of them laudable: reduced emissions, a modern port, protections against climate change, in combination with their guiding principle of financial self-sustainability. But those are their goals. They shared at meeting 2 a single slide of, or maybe that's meeting 3, single slide of things they had heard from the communities. That was meeting 3. Including that the community knew there was a housing crisis, but some folks were still concerned with gentrification. The problem was that these slides were not open for discussion. They were not there to start a discussion. In lieu of that discussion, what followed was a tightly controlled workshop where the community was put in a reactive position. And if somehow you want to put up the slide with the little yellow blocks, this is the moment. We were asked to add enough market rate housing in the form of little yellow blocks to a site model in order to pay for the port and buy our own public infrastructure, including schools. And there you see it. That was, we were asked to, we put blocks on the model. And by the way, the blocks were, they told us there was a mistake and they were taller than they were supposed to be. So when a picture was taken of the model as if it were something we wanted, it actually showed more height than we were willing to bear. So where am I? The EDC, as I said, thank you, photographed the blocks, but they did not document the discussion we had standing at the table around the values we intended to communicate through the exercise. It was a kind of more transactional game of Monopoly. Did we pay for what we built? And the model it produced was meant to, as the photographs were shared as a stand-in for our aspirations, our as well as our zoning envelopes and our land use. You know, that was the totality of what we were envisioning. But that is not visioning. Visioning is the third step. First of all, it's supposed to come after you put down your aspirations, right? Then you find physical form, but it's not just physical form. Visioning is supposed to capture your social and economic dimensions of potential futures, right? And they're not always linked together. Designers and planners, and you know, you've all seen visionings, but designers and planners eventually help translate that visioning, which is social, economic, as well as physical, into models and drawings. And then they go back and they ask the community, is this what you meant your future to look like, to feel like, to be like? And that's iterative. And to Carly's point, it takes time. And part of the problem is they don't have the time. So that's why they're collapsing everything. Okay, the fourth step, decision-making at the stakeholder table, kind of at the end of the visioning process. As always, a thorny question in community engagement is how multiple scrappy, contentious voices of individuals will be represented at the table where decision-making happens. Who is at the table? Who and when are they chosen? And what is their role and authority? EDC appointed the task force at the get-go. But putting that aside for a moment, we should ask, does EDC have the right people at the table? And in many ways, almost, although it's tricky, it's a catch, right? They've been very careful to include community members, representative of multiple constituencies, like Carly for small business. Who could be better? Who would say no? Jim Timpakis for the Working Waterfront, Karen Blondell for NYCHA Red Hook Houses, and electeds at different levels and persuasions. And the only person they don't have there is James to talk about the Columbia Waterfront. So Columbia Waterfront's missing. But having a task force that is almost beyond reproach gives legitimacy to the process. So it's very clever. A process that I have represented as fraud on a community level. I guess now we know it's fraud at task force level too. The flaws of direct community engagement, you know, that we've gone through makes it in our ability to inform the task force about our values and their ability to communicate back to the stakeholders with information key. How has that worked? Well, it seems that while the lines of communication with the task force are indeed open, informally or by appointment, if you're a senator, they are basically ad hoc with no formal structure or EDC support. You know, we don't get report backs, and they're not ways for us to engage the task force. So let's assume the task force good intentions as community representatives. Then the final question is their authority within a community process, right? In a good community process, there's some authority. The task force, in fact, will vote yay and nay to the EDC scenario, and a 2/3 majority is required either way. I sometimes say 60%, some 2/3. The plan stops if there's no approval, but there's a lot of pressure, and this has to be counted, to vote yes with the threat of the loss of federal funding at the end of the year. You know, there's that time thing. If voted down, my understanding is that alternatives will be presented. And if those are voted down, then these alternatives will be issued with comment. And it says it on the EDC website. And what happens then is unclear, given that the task force and the community it now must represent is officially and ultimately advisory. And yeah, that's it. That's it from the trenches.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you very much. You know, just starting out, just as a point of information, how did we get here in terms of the federal funding? Because that obviously, I mean, what you described, what colleagues, what we're all talking about is a process that is hard and is time consuming. And the city has imposed this pressure, this deadline on itself because of the specter of losing federal funding. So can somebody explain how that happened and why we got where we are? Carly, I'm looking to you for that. I figured you would know, but you're muted.
This is part of the larger federal funding package for infrastructure, I believe, and it was part of a grant that came through Dan Goldman's office. So, the time pressure is twofold. That is, one is that it has to be a city match from the city budget process. And while we believe it's entirely possible to match that in the budget without a site plan being there, right now we are being told that they won't put it in the budget without that site plan. So that is a procedural question that I think is still an open question. The larger question then on the federal funding is, could it be statched?
Yeah. And is there some concern that the new Trump administration would do the best to take the money away if they could? Is that
yes,
yeah.
that is a concern.
Yeah, yeah. So it is a real deadline and a real problem because it's a significant amount of money, right?
It isn't. If you think about large public investments, city, state, and federal, it could all be much bigger. And if we think about port infrastructure and what other countries put into it, especially those leading, it's very little.
Yeah, it's very little. Okay.
Can I just add to that too? Because this is actually something you told me, Carly, which is that money is only tied to a very small part of the reconstruction of the port. And what they've done that is the thing is the makes for the time crunch and all the Sturman drawing is they folded it in to a much larger master planning process.
Yeah.
All the EDC has to do is say, okay, at this point, we only have time to say, we're going to fix the port, which we've been saying for a while, and we're going to use that federal money, and we're going to start a separate master planning process for the larger site after.
Right.
So, it's not the only way to approach keeping that money.
Yeah, no, thank you, Deborah. I was gonna, one didn't require the other. What we're going through is not a function of the federal deadline. It's a function of how that deadline has been interpreted and utilized. And it is still, as you said, David, or and Carly indicated as well, I mean, it's all based on the assumption that we're going to get that money and Elon Musk isn't going to stop it, which, I mean, maybe we will.
Yeah. I mean, you might argue, I think is what was Carly's point, that a project of this magnitude, you can't be forced into bad decisions because of a minor component of funding, right? You've got to really play the long game and think about the long future of this site. So there's two things I'd like to.
Can I just piggyback really quickly on the timing of it, David?
Yeah.
One of the things that's actually really important about the timing of it, particularly in the context of new transportation needs, is that the Brooklyn Queens Expressway has one lane closed north and southbound through the cantilevered part of Brooklyn Heights. What that has meant in practice is that Columbia Street is essentially a wall of traffic, 5 days a week and much of Saturday and Sunday as well. It has meant that we have our one public transit, the B61, is pretty much useless. When I walk my dog, I go faster than the cars and the bus, and the dog stops to sniff at every tree, right? We don't know what is going to happen with the BQE or when, and the idea that we're going, and this again is right here, right? Like we are one block from the BQE. The overflow traffic from that lane closure is right through the heart of what they're talking about. And we don't know when that's going to happen. And yet we're plowing forward without any clarity on what our transportation infrastructure is going to be.
Right. Yeah. And that speaks to Deb's point about the first step having to be a knowledge share, about having really all the information, and not just narrowly focusing on one particular issue. But I wanted to ask you, and this is kind of a question for you, James, too. If we think about what the EDC is doing, which as Deb described, is really kind of stacking the deck, saying the only solution is to have all of this commercial in order to pay for the project. So we're going to give you all these yellow Lego blocks, and all you have to do is put them where you want to put them. Kind of really just sort of, fixing the game up before it starts. How would you envision a planning process that was able to quantify some of the values and human needs that you were describing that are not tangible in dollars necessarily, or not yet tangible in dollars? How do we quantify those things and get them into a decision-making process?
Well, I mean, you can certainly quantify park usage. You can certainly quantify, freight volume that is not going to be going over bridges, or that is not going over bridges because it is being handled on the water. And those things are easily quantified. It's often in the translation of, those clear benefits into some kind of dollar amount. Sort of for the larger metro area, where it gets really complicated, and you run in, and very difficult, and then you run into the kind of limits of reducing planning decisions to that which, can have a firm dollar amount attached to it. So yeah, and just to be clear, when I was doing the Legos with them, the EDC staffer, at my table kept putting market rate housing onto our little board, and the people around the table kept taking it out and putting other things, and they kept putting it in. And that was, so it's not just an abstract kind of processual kind of stacking the deck. It was quite literal in that moment, hands like going past each other as the EDC staffer was making the desired outcome.
Yeah.
No, she was paying for everything you were spending.
Oh, okay. I mean, maybe there has to be a process whereby these things that are not quantifiable in dollar terms have value and have to be considered, right? That it's not just about money, because so many of these EDC projects seem to be predicated on the idea that everything has to be paid for, and that's the only game is to figure out how to pay for things, and these human values and needs are not necessarily addressed. But let me go to the other thing I wanted to address. Deborah outlined what I think seems like a very sensible and thorough community engagement process, beginning with knowledge sharing, the statement of values, and then the visioning. Do you think, my panelists, that it would be possible to build that type of process into the current setup of EDC, task force, and GPP? Could it be done?
Yeah. I mean, not now. I mean, and I mean,
What do you mean not now?
It's too late.
Well,
they'd have to roll it back.
Well, let's say the timeline is an artificial timeline. Do you think the players involved could actually adopt your strategy successfully?
Could they, or would they? Yeah,
Well,
I mean,
yes.
I think that's the big difference. They're smart people. I know them.
So you feel they could, but they probably wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking, it's really interesting. I'm sorry, David, but I'll stop, because we always compare the EDC to what it used to be, which was the UDC, right, and romanticize the UDC. I was speaking to someone who worked at the UDC and its heyday over the weekend. And they said that the coming to the table with the answer already decided happened for the UDC too.
Yeah. But I guess
one thing I would say, I'm sorry, David, one thing I would say is in processes like this, trust is hard won, and easily lost. And it would be difficult. It would have been, it would have been very easy, at the front end to pursue something like, well, not very easy because the logistics are really hard. It's an enormous site that covers a set of different neighborhoods with a lot of different stakeholders, so it would have been challenging, not just logistically, but also sort of like coming to a unified vision or a set of values would be demanding, but you can't do it once there's no trust at all.
Yeah. Yeah, so it may be too late. I mean, I guess part of my question was, you might make the argument, that the city processes are such a mess. And the reason we have an EDC is somebody has to take the bull by the horns and get this thing done, right? So if you accept that premise for the moment, under that scenario, could you do what Deb is describing? Could you still have a successful engagement process that really adopted those principles?
You know what, I think that it goes back to knowledge sharing and trust, that if there's the sense that people are coming from the Rotterdam to tell us about ports, they're coming, from Georgia to tell us about trucking, they're coming, that it's not, that the door is open for information that will change people's minds to be presented to people in power. That then even if you don't get your way, I think people understand. You make 4 asks. Anybody who's done community engagement for, you're not going to get everything you want. You're not going to get everyone, you're not going to get everyone to be happy. That's like, but I think, so that's why the trust, to James' point, is so important. If you have the trust, then people say, okay, we know how difficult this is. We know this is what we got. We got the one important thing. I don't know, James, what do you think?
No, that sounds right to me, Deborah. That sounds exactly right to me. Yeah.
David, can I interject a quick question? I find the conversation really very enlightening, and I see many similarities with other very large projects, including Penn Station or another project for the redevelopment of NYCHA campuses in Chelsea. The one player that has not been mentioned in this conversation is actually the developer. Can you actually speak a little bit to the role that the developer is playing? And, is it fair to say that maybe they are the ones who are driving the, the interest, and that, this is that vision that really is taking precedence? I don't know, Deborah, if you have any thoughts on that.
Oh, you're asking me? The developer who's not in the room?
Yeah.
Well, the EDC is mentally the developer. They kind of are developers, right? But they're on a great track record in with Atlantic Yards and some other projects. But they are because they have to ultimately, they know they have to get a developer on board, so they're thinking like a developer, right? Is that true? Would you guys
Do we
say?
know who the developer is going to be for this project?
No, I don't think we do.
No.
No, we don't. I wanted to go back to something Carly raised about the idea of the Blue Highways Initiative and the idea of waterfront planning and the idea. I wanted to ask Carly, there has been discussion about creating a unified waterfront agency that would have jurisdiction, that would unify all the disparate people who are kind of messing around with the waterfront. Do you think that's a good idea? Do you think that's ever going to happen? And how do you think we could accomplish that?
Yeah, there's a proposal on the table right now in City Council addressing that. I think it has to be broader than just how do we work across agencies to make sure that public access and all of these different interests are taken into account. I think the piece that probably even at a city level would still be lacking is that strategic understanding at the regional and even national levels. So I think that's something, more vertically integrated needs to happen. And this is part of a legacy of lack of funding in all areas. Some states are starting to rectify this now because they see the need and the value in it. But yes, right now that's kind of one piece of the puzzle on the table. There's also a piece of legislation that both New Jersey and New York would have to pass that is about reconfiguring the Port Authority. And so the attention on this is growing, but it is kind of like a lost wisdom, right? Like we've just kind of forgotten how to do it. And I think some of this feels like flailing in part because there's just nothing, there's no ecosystem remaining at those levels of authority to sort of say, we do need to plan for this. This is how we do it. We do need to fund it. This is how we do it. It just doesn't exist for maritime. I think that's a big problem. The city piece is important, but I think it's going to have to go beyond that.
Yeah. Somebody was asking in the Q&A about the role of the Waterfront Alliance and the role of RETI. Do we know if how much they've been involved?
The Waterfront Alliance is involved in the advisory group process, and then RETI. I'm not sure if they're on one of the advisory committees, but certainly have been involved in the community as is also involved. So yes, those voices are there, and I think have also drawn attention to some of the problems with the process, the assumptions, based on some of the letters that the Waterfront Alliance has put out to date. So yes, they're very much involved in part of this.
Yeah. A number of people have been asking in the Q&A about other precedents where this process might have been successful. And I keep thinking the ones I know about, which is Penn Station and Atlantic Yards, have been pretty disastrous. So do our panelists have any thoughts about successful projects under this process? Well, I guess the answer is no.
Yeah, there definitely are. At this scale,
Right.
it's. I mean, I know tons of. I'm working on. I did one in Sheepshead Bay that was at the scale of several blocks that worked out real well, and I'm working with these wonderful people, the East New York CLT and Cypress Hills right now, and they're doing extremely well. They've got a site that crosses a borough line, which would seem impossible. And they're gonna have this cross-borough eco infrastructure for water management and housing. I mean, they're doing great. But this is just at a scale where the kind of, I mean, maybe they just shouldn't have called it a community-led process to begin with. I honestly think they, a watery grave was dug just inadvertently, because it's too tough. And I think, and I'll stop, but I think, David, you've asked so many good questions that really what it tells us is the problem isn't this project. It's larger about government and, what Carly called the ecosystem. It's about the fact that we're still siloed amongst our agencies. And it's that we don't have a process. I mean, that's really your question. We don't have a process that operates at this scale.
Yeah, I mean, that was, exactly. I mean, I love these. Very happy to have a shout out to the East New York CLT folks. Hannah and Boris and all of them are some of my favorite people in the city. There's all kinds of great community-driven planning happening all over. Anything from what Northwest Bronx Community Clergy Coalition put together for the Kingsbridge Armory that the EDC decided not to go with, to the Bronx-wide planning process. They led to, all kinds of great neighborhood planning happening all over the city, in Western Queens, in the
But were these
Rockaways.
all EDC? Were these all EDC projects?
No,
No.
that's the
Well,
problem.
that was really my question. Were the
Right.
successful projects led by this type of arrangement with EDC and a GPP by the state that actually work out well? I mean, in the Q&A, Tom Fox is talking about Hudson River Park as an example of a mega project in the Westway that actually, after 8 years of battle, ended up with a reasonable outcome. But
Battery Park City?
was that EDC? No, that was UDC, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, it may be that this process doesn't have a great track record, and for all the time-consuming and difficult and painful process of doing true community visioning and engagement that Deborah describes is what you got to do. It's just how it is, right? And if that means you lose some federal money, then you lose some federal money. Does that seem fair?
So just adding, I think, to what Deb and James were saying, I think, there's a fear to desire a process like that because it's messy. There is a lack of belief that we could do something really great here. And it is so enormous and in piling on so many decades of questions unanswered that I think that government is scared to try to figure it out. The political, timeline for any one politician is too short to figure this out. Like everything about how that works is just it's just too scared to try to actually figure out. But I think you can. And I just going back to something that James was saying about quantifying, more human benefits. They haven't really even gotten around to quantifying the Blue Highway benefits. There's no revenue estimates even for what it would generate. So just the first step of saying, what if we started with food and beverage? How would we make that work? Draw it, put some numbers on it, get some partners at the table, try to figure it out. There's a reticence to do that at every level. I think it's both the community engagement, but it's also just the actual work of it that I think is just too scary and too large. And it leads to this disbelief that this process and these people could actually do it. And the sad thing is, I think that they could.
Yeah, yeah. The very distinguished former councilman, Carlos Menchaca, has put a question in the Q&A that I'd like to put to you guys. Carlos is saying, can we learn anything from the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal process that started with reacquiring the 72 acres from a bankruptcy and ultimately having a master lease negotiated between EDC and the city council? That negotiated master lease gave way to what we see today, requirements for maritime uses, labor agreements, etc. Are you all familiar with that process, and what's your response to that?
I honestly have more questions because I think we do need to be looking at other examples, looking at the investments and how those were set up, looking at what a phase, whether it was allowed to be more of a phased process than this one is, thinking about what did they think about the revenue generation, what they're putting there is going to be great. And I'm so glad it's happening. And is it really going to generate enough revenue that, it's really that much greater than what a really functioning port could generate? I think so. I actually have just more questions for people who have been involved in some of these processes and all around the city, because I think that kind of knowledge sharing is also really important and isn't happening.
Yes. And in fact, Carlos, talking about Carlos Menchaca, he successfully fought off another similar move to make Industry City into a commercial hotel retail hub that ultimately he was able to defeat. So there are certainly examples to learn from.
Well, it shows that you need a champion
Yeah, there you go.
like Carlos, right?
I'm just looking at
I
Sorry,
actually
and,
do think I do think that's true. That's government working, right?
right. Yes, I think that's true. Carolina Salguero in the Q&A is saying in general, but as this is using the state GPP, the rules of the DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, should be addressed, as those surely are what is limiting how the new marginal pier can be shaped and how many square feet of water the new pier can cover. Is that the case? What is the role of the DEC in this?
Oh, I'm not enough of a fool to tell Carolina about DEC's regulation of port, of piers. That, yeah. If Carolina is saying that, I trust her.
Okay.
Carolina is the ED of Portside, New York. If for
Oh,
people
I
who
see.
don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
We'll share that an important piece that the transparency is a little bit lacking on is the multiple versions of marginal piers in some of the plans we've seen and how that relates to the increasing cost. One of the questions that came up at an early task force meeting, the plan has always been you have to densify the port so that we have room for other things. And to densify the port, you actually have to measure the load that the land can carry because you're talking about stacking containers and things very high. And and so as that conversation has extended, it seems that they need more space for the housing, and so the marginal pier keeps being built out further into the water. There is a limit, as what Carolina is saying, which is why in the marginal pier plan that's bigger, Pier 7 has to go away. And so they're building out more space ultimately because that's where they need to put the housing because the infrastructure is there. But in the process, they're actually radically increasing the cost of the infrastructure needed for the port.
Okay. Okay.
So again, yet again, though, to Carly's point, sort of yet again, there is a decision that is made that is, sort of centering the goals of real estate development. And then even if it is incurring extra costs for the other uses, that is what will happen.
Yeah, yeah. Could somebody explain what the role currently is of the community board? Because I know that CB6, the ED, is on the task force, I believe. I mean, normally the community board would be the focal point for much of the community engagement, and I assume that's not really happening in this case. But do they have any role at all in the process?
Not outside of the positions that are part of the defined process. So I will say that they have recently posted some of the materials online, and so they're providing that as a public service. I don't know if they have other plans on the table to convene public comment or anything.
Yeah, I don't think they wanted to get into the game of trying to be community organizers. They understand that community boards bring together fractious groups of people with different agendas, and they understand how much work it is to get people on the same table, and so at the on the same whatever it's called. So they didn't want to get into that business, so they have not actively been a way for the community to figure out what they want to do with a single voice.
Right. I mean, one thing I would just do a little plug, and I totally agree with what Carly and Deborah have been saying. CB6 has been peripheral at best in the process. They are hosting a meeting about it tomorrow night. If you live in CB6, go. It can be either in person or virtual. Go and participate and let them know what you think.
It's going to be at the Van Allen on Bond Street.
I haven't looked because I teach tomorrow night, so I haven't actually I can't be there no matter where it is because I got to be in a classroom in New Brunswick. So yeah.
There's another suggestion in the Q&A. What about if you were to break the 122 acres up and not try and treat it as one huge plan and say, okay, we've decided what we're going to do with the maritime and we'll do that and we'll treat them separately. Do you think that would be a sensible approach?
I mean, whether by land or by process, that's been suggested. I've been suggesting that since September. I said, if we have a deadline on some of this money, then it's about the piers, then let's figure out the piers and figure out the rest later. And we kind of just get the same pushback that we've gotten.
Yeah.
Right, but I think that's a brilliant idea. The thing is, partly what Carly and James have been saying the whole time is that, and this is what planners and architects aren't bad at. You have to think at many scales at the same time. So there's a lot of decisions where you could divide it into different parcels, but there's some things that will go across boundaries, like water goes across boundaries, electricity, whatever it is. So, but you could certainly reduce what you needed to decide, right? Certain infrastructural moves, and leave the rest to be faced.
Sure. I mean,
Why not?
We're already excluding all land-based, transportation infrastructure by excluding the BQE or by doing it completely separately from either, the covering of the ditch, which is a very big question in the Columbia Street waterfront, or what the potential plan is for the BQE moving forward. So we're already doing what I would call very bad planning in a million different ways, but not knowing what your transportation infrastructure is going to be when you embark on essentially the construction of a whole, I mean, the newest version was 12,900 units, was what they were talking about, with no idea what our transportation infrastructure is going to be. So the idea that we have to do it all together for good planning purposes is a nonsense, because we're not doing that.
Yeah. So how would you subdivide it then? You would treat the maritime uses as one thing, or would you break that down further into the cruise terminal and the container operation, or how would you do it?
Now that's the one part that's a really interesting question, because I think the one thing, first, one thing that's different about industry than other uses is that it kind of has to be able to grow or it dies. In a at least in a capitalist economy, right? Yeah. That there has to, you need to leave it a little, and you'd have to get experts in to tell you what that meant. And if I'm wrong, because as Carly says, you can go up instead of out or whatever, or out instead of back, but there has to be some kind of future planning and future proofing for economic growth when it comes to an industrial use, and as well as the transportation planning. So, but that does not preclude still, making a kind of a caesura between uses, or dividing it into different parts. We're really good at that, the Germans, the IBA projects, IBA Emscher, IBA Berlin, very long phased master plans that are broken up into many, many parts.
Yeah. I just want to re-quote something that Carolina Salguero again put into the Q&A. She says, please say that there's a survey created by Portside and the Maritime Association of the Port Authority to tell us what you want to learn about maritime and how you want to learn it. And if you look in the Q&A, there's a link there. So please go there. It sounds like a good thing to do. Greg O'Connell has a post in the Q&A. Reasonably successful GPP would be WTC, World Trade Center. My question is regarding port operations. What happens in 5 to 10 years if nothing is done and disinvestment continues? Is there a mechanism to hold a public property owner entity accountable to maintain its property? We can't assume a port operator will be willing to stay there in perpetuity. What do we think about that?
I mean, I'll share that one of the scenarios that has been proposed is what happens if we do nothing.
Yes.
And so I think to some degree that's kind of trying to think about what that looks like. I mean, a port operator, the first thing that they would want is a long-term lease, so 30 years, 99 years. And that's pulling in the investments to do the work. And so presumably, if that happened, that if that operator wanted to leave, there would be a very well-functioning port to hand off or sell to somebody else, I think. That's a reasonable conclusion there. We'd be dealing with a long-term lease situation that we haven't had there in 50, 60 years. But I think, let me just go back, and I think in terms of the property ownership, that would still be with the city. And so the question is just, again, going back to how are we going to conceive long-term of public investment in ports? Is that going to change or is it not? And I think that's why that's kind of undergirding some of that. There's some degree of pessimistic thinking that if we had that as the fallback plan, that the city would use it for whatever the heck it wanted to, and it might be dirty and grimy and not very helpful to the community, which is why as a task force, we've asked for a more reasonable fallback plan. It is very possible that the buildings that they're planning wouldn't get through EIS and all of the other parts of the GPP process. And if they don't, or if it takes too long, we really do need a better short-term and long-term plan that isn't just do nothing. So that is one of the requests currently out there in terms of site plans. Greg, but I don't know if that actually answers your question.
Tom Fox has a comment in the Q&A. Converting Pier 7 and rebuilding 8, 9A and 9B to support maritime industries of the future, such as people and package movements within the harbor, would be critical and would save hundreds of millions of dollars, lighter loads on existing pier footprint with no permitting hassle. Pier 10 could still be used for containers if needed. So that's an argument for we should be supporting maritime users, we should be planning for their future, we should be expecting them to grow. Is that a losing game? Are we never going to get there? Is it not really a realistic business proposition?
I'll just say that, we talked about a couple of organizations that are on some of the advisory committees, but we have the Maritime Association. We have all of these experts at the table who are saying this can be a very functional port, including our, existing entities on the property. Ports are making more money now than they ever have. It is, again, increasing attention towards it. I think part of what is referenced here too is the idea of, well, what if we didn't do a marginal pier? That's not even being considered as an option. It could be like you could keep doing stuff here and not have a marginal pier. Not ideal, but you could. So there's just a lot of options on the table. And again, that sort of reticence to really imagine. And so what it's become is kind of this port preserve where it's just like, we're going to set aside this for unknown future uses. But it isn't getting into all the fun stuff that I think Tom is bringing up. Is like, well, let's start thinking about what that would look like and actually bringing those people to the table and designing those systems.
Yeah.
And I do think, and I saw one person put it into the Q&A, right? That, we don't have a ton of working maritime left in, lots of things can go in a lot of different places. Ports can only go on the water. We have it there. All of my instincts have been since the very beginning of this that it should be maritime, like full stop, and whatever it would need to kind of make that happen. Yeah. And I have no doubt that the people that Carly is listening to in the task force know exactly what they're talking about when they say that, this can be a thriving, far more thriving than Port Authority has allowed it to be over the last several decades.
Yeah. And as a number of people have pointed out, once it's gone, it's gone. You're never going to get it back.
Yeah.
And if you think about the rapidly diminishing amount of maritime uses we have left, there is an instinct to preserve them, you would think, right? But it doesn't seem to be factoring into the scenario that's been set up by the EDC. Do you think, here's a question, do you think there's something sort of unconstitutional about this. I mean, it's a bit like the way the City Planning Commission and the City Planning Department work. You have an agency that's the lead agency, but is also the sort of jury that's deciding the outcome. So you've got, seems to me, something of a conflict in this process, in that whoever's managing it is also making the decision, ostensibly based on input from the task force people. But do we find, are we comfortable with that, or do we find that that's a problematic arrangement?
Well, it's very clearly problematic. I would also say it kind of, that's the history of the field that I work in. For the most part, most of planning history is some form of that. So maybe we've just internalized, processes like that. But yeah, so it's exceedingly problematic and also extremely common in the history of planning.
Okay. Oh, somebody's just pointing out the CB6 meeting tomorrow is at the 250 Baltic Community
Oh,
Room.
okay, cool. The one right off of Court, right.
And there's also a Zoom link, which is also in the Q&A. Somebody said not everybody can see the full Q&A. Is that, I can certainly see it.
That's right, David. I think that the attendees are not able to see it. But definitely the City Club will send an email to all the participants so that you will have all this information in an email as soon as this event.
Okay. There are way too many comments here for me to do all of them tonight. So yes, they'll have to they'll have to follow up later. I'm just trying to pick out some of the broader issues that are relevant to the topic we're discussing. So let me see. Somebody's saying, doesn't the Port Authority have exclusive access to ports in the New York, New Jersey region? Can New York City own and support a maritime port without conflict with Port Authority of New York and New Jersey? Is that, what do we think about that?
I'd have to call a friend on that one, but my understanding is that there's actually other types of privately owned port properties within that ecosystem. And that even though, this one will be owned by the city, ports, the Port Authority has still an interest in it because it supports the larger ecosystem. So I think my understanding is that it functions a little bit more like an ecosystem, but we would have to have a real maritime person answer that. Maybe someone who's listening can put it in the chat.
Right. Okay.
It says 180 port properties in the harbor, with Port Authority only responsible for a handful.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. That's interesting.
Mm.
So that speaks to the issue about having a unified waterfront agency, doesn't it? That can actually help deal with that.
Right. Well, I mean, EDC itself has managed maritime, manage in the literal, not making quality judgments about how well they have done in that role. But it is not a new role for the EDC, to sort of have that.
Yeah. John Lavers put in the Q&A, if ports are considered infrastructure, why must it be subsidized instead of paid for by government funds like all other forms of infrastructure?
That is such an important statement. That's one of the most, that's where they really, EDC loses trust, by saying that we have to pay for public infrastructure.
Don, that was my point. You just said it more concisely. What I said in like 4 paragraphs, you just did there.
There you go. And I suppose there are plenty of other examples where infrastructure like this is publicly supported. I mean, the
I
EDC
think there's a confusion. There's a real confusion because I think the model is the false analogy is always between Brooklyn Bridge Park and this. Now, Brooklyn Bridge Park, you can contest its public-private partnerships on its own terms, right? But to say, that a publicly owned private, or whatever it's called, private space or public-private partnership space should be the model for the port, it is just, that's not a good analogy. Carly's talked about the federal security needed at a port, how it serves our national interests and security. There's the fact of how it operates, what's it's used for. Just because it's a continuation on the other side of Atlantic Ave of an edge does not mean it's the same animal. And I think there's a lot of confusion, and I think the EDC was trying to sell the vision that a lot of people who kind of, and there are, we're not the only voices out there. Some people want lots of housing and lots of parking. I think it's great, though, in the way it's being pitched. And that's fine, but I think that the notion that the entire waterfront becomes a kind of Brooklyn Bridge Park is where it comes from. And I don't think it's, necessarily an accurate way to describe what must happen for this to work.
Yeah. Well, Brooklyn Bridge Park was enormously controversial because of the handing over of parkland.
Yes, exactly. But that's your point. That's how this, began with John saying, well, isn't this public infrastructure? And it's as contentious it is as it is for a waterfront park to have that complicated relationship to the public, for a port with all its dimensions to have that same structure is very, very different. And I'm not forgiving one to excuse the to try to liberate the other from the same structure. I'm just saying you have to not think they're the same thing.
Right. Oh, John's just asking quickly, how many people are in this webinar? I'm not sure. There were 250 people signed up, but I don't know how many have actual logged on. So
it was very robust, actually. I think that at the peak of attendance, we had 145 participants. So, and we thank you very much for that. I think we're getting close to the end of our time, David.
Yes, I've got one more question I'd like to put to the panel, because it's from Melissa and it's a very general, I think, a good closing question. Can this group share any guidance for next steps to hold the EDC more accountable to community needs? There you go. Because you guys are going to do it. You're the ones.
Okay, well, first of all, part of it is a structural issue. The EDC is accountable to the mayor and pretty much nobody else. And so that is a structural issue with the EDC. It requires having the ability to move the mayor, or in this case, with this project, former Deputy Mayor Maria Torres Springer, who was very much involved in kind of greasing the wheels between Albany and New York on this. But it requires a political capacity to move the mayor. Otherwise, the EDC is insulated. And quite frankly, I don't know that my council member, Shahana Hanif, has any ability, or Alexa Aviles has any ability in Red Hook to move Mayor Adams on pretty much anything, it seems to me.
David, you got a lot of good answers in the chat. Did you see them?
Yeah, I see that. I see that coming in, yes.
You gotta read them.
The mayor's race. When Brad Lander's mayor, things will be different, right?
Right.
Indeed.
EDC use ULURP, sue them.
Make EDC use ULURP. That'll be the day. Yeah. Yeah, actually, there's a good point, actually, when the potential mayoral candidates are now doing the rounds and holding public hearings and so on. Maybe there's the time to get them on paper now to commit to how this process might be improved. There's certainly time. I think that the primaries are in June, are they not? So it's a good time to strike that
Years
one.
ago, I was part of a group, a coalition of labor and community groups, calling ourselves Redefining Economic Development in New York City. And we launched our plan. So, we rebranded ourselves because Brad Lander, who had been active in that when he was at Pratt, was running for council. And so got a rebranding with the folks at Jobs with Justice to One City, One Future. And part of the issue was also that redefining economic development, aside from it being Red New York City, which was an acronym that maybe a politician didn't want, was that nobody knows what the hell economic development is anyway. And so it's an exceedingly difficult thing to build a political constituency around, and have it be different when nobody have what be different. We don't even know what the it is that we're, and yeah. The day we launched that platform, Bloomberg reached a deal with Chris Quinn to stay on for a third term, which kind of killed that. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. Somebody is suggesting the answer is litigation. So Layla, we got to get John LeBeer lined up. I hope he's got time.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, the City Club is notorious, for being litigious, and we have a robust law committee. So here you go. David, thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to all the participants. As I said, at the peak of attendance, I think we reached 145 participants. We know that you have many other things and other opportunities to get busy in the evening. So really appreciate that you spend that evening with us. As you can tell, the Brooklyn Maritime Terminal redevelopment is a project with far-reaching implications. And as we've heard from our wonderful panelists tonight, the stakes are really high. So as we conclude this this panel, I just want to say that the City Club intends to remain very focused on this issue. We'll continue to provide information. We will send an email follow-up to tonight's event with some sort of like show notes with links, information, and actions that you can take. There was mention of a community board coming up, a Zoom link to actually join and address to find the location if you want to attend in person. So we're going to put all of this information, and hopefully you will find it helpful. I would like to extend a special thank you to John Shapiro and Tom Fox, who are the co-chairs of the City Club's Waterfront Committee. They are really powerhouses, and keeping these issues that have to do with waterfront front and center for the City Club, but also for the entire city. So I really want to thank them for their leadership. I want to say a huge thank you as well to Juan Rivero, who is the chair of the City Club's program committee, who worked very, very hard to put this event together. This would not have happened without him, and I really want to thank him for ensuring that these conversations continue. Please stay tuned, because this is part of a series. This is the kickoff of a three-part event. Next week, we will have another panel discussion on the same topic. So, please stay tuned, check your emails. We'll be sending notifications, and hopefully you will register to attend. And I want to mention two pieces of information. The first one is put on your radar, journalist Norman Otter, who runs a Watchdog blog. He's actually paying close attention to this issue. He has written an article. Once again, it will be on the email that we are sending. There is also a petition that is circulating, and if you're interested or inclined, we will also have that as a resource if you want to make your voice heard through signing a petition. This is also an option. And just to piggyback on what the panelists said, it is an election year, and as much as maybe getting focused on EDC and making EDC sexy may be a little bit esoteric at this juncture, I think that it is really a great opportunity. All the elected officials in New York City are up for election or re-election. There's a number of open seats. The mayoral race is obviously the main focus, but the city controller plays a huge role. This is an open seat in this cycle. So I'm really urging you to become involved in, in this electoral process. Civic engagement is obviously not just going to vote. Of course, go and vote. But petitioning has just started actually yesterday. Petitioning is ballot access. In order for a candidate to qualify and make it to the ballot, they need to collect signatures. So if you see folks with the green sheets on a clipboard, please consider signing a petition. This is actually how we really strengthen democracy. Participating is really important, being focused on the issues and then translating these issues in support to specific candidates can really be a game changer. So I'm urging all of you to become participants in this process. As I said, next week and the week after, we will continue to talk about the Brooklyn Maritime Terminal. Thank you again so much to the panelists, to David for moderating this conversation with such elegance and great questions. And I want to also say that, as you know, the City Club is a non-for-profit. We are a grassroots organization. We rely on contributions from folks like you. And we are really urging you to make a donation. If you found that this program was interesting, insightful, useful, please consider donating. There's no too small donations, so we really appreciate any contribution to our effort. Thank you again so much, and I wish you all a very good evening. Goodbye.
Everybody,
Bye.
thank you.
Bye. Thank you.